Namaste, and welcome to all to our Bhagavad Gita class at the Vedanta Society of Greater Austin. This, unlike most of our Gita classes, is a pre-recorded class. I'm recording it the evening before because Saturday, while you were watching this, I have a 4-hour conference with some people around the country, about 12 of us getting together. So I'm recording it the previous night. But otherwise, and so that means that there'll be no question and answers this time. But next week, next Saturday, we'll be back to the normal. I will give the live class as usual. So without further ado, we'll just to begin. I'll begin as always with the chant. Om Parthaya Pratibodhitam Bhagavata Narayanena Swayam Vyasena Grathitam Purana Munina Madhye Mahabharatam Advaitam Ritavarshinim Bhagavatim Ashtadashadhyayinim Ambatvam Anusandadhami Bhagavad Gita Bhavadveshinim Vasudeva Sutan Devam Kamsachanuramardanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadgurum Mukam Karoti Vachalam Pangum Langhayate Girim Yatkripa Tamaham Vande Paramananda Madhavam. Om, O Mother Bhagavad Gita, we meditate on you who were made known to Partha by the Lord Narayana himself. You who were included in the Mahabharata by the ancient sage Vyasa. You, the goddess who rains down the nectar of Advaita, non-dual knowledge, in 18 chapters. You, the destroyer of relative existence. We worship Krishna, the world teacher, the son of Vasudeva, the delight of his mother Devaki, and the slayer of the demons Kamsa and Chanur. We adore that supremely blissful Madhava, Krishna, by whose grace the mute are made eloquent and the lame are enabled to cross over mountains. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Om Peace, peace, peace be unto us all. So, in this class, we will begin where we left off last time, and that is with verse 23 of chapter 2. So here Sri Krishna is teaching Arjuna, who had become despondent, who had decided not to fight. As you know, I won't go back over all of the background. Sri Krishna begins in verse 11 of chapter 2 to teach Arjuna the truth about the self, the Atman, that you are the birthless, you are the deathless, you are the changeless, because that was the medicine which Arjuna needed in order to face the situation that he was in. Again, he was on the battlefield. He was in a situation where he was going to kill and or be killed. So the ultimate dynamic, critical situation, a life and death situation. And so in that situation, when he had become emotionally distraught, because he realized, and he actually realized the consequences of his actions. And so normally you would expect, as I've said before, the teacher to be sympathetic with his claims that no, it's better to practice ahimsa, let me not enter into battle, let me beg for my food rather than killing the people that I love. And Sri Krishna says, no, you have a duty to do. Your whole life has brought you to this point. You have a swadharma, your own dharma, that which is your duty to do, to protect the innocent, to establish righteousness. And so you must go forward and fight. And so he's in the midst of teaching him about the nature of the Atman, because that will give him the strength to face the critical situation he's in. So continuing where we left off, we'll come to verse 23, which says, Nainam chindanti shastrani, nainam dahati pavakaha, na chainam kledayantyapo, na shoshayati marutaha. So here Sri Krishna tells Arjuna, Nainam chindanti shastrani. This self, this which you really are. Again, the self is not a thing. The self is not something that is inside of us. The self is you. The self is me. So he's telling Arjuna, you, Arjuna, weapons cannot cut you. Nainam chindanti shastrani, shastrani, weapons. They can't cut you. Weapons cannot cut you. But that sounds ridiculous. Of course they can cut me. They can cut my arm, they can cut my leg, they can cut my throat. But no, you who are the self, you are the Atman, you are not the body. And so yes, weapons can kill the body, but they cannot touch you, the real you. Our problem is we've identified with the body, and so anything that happens to the body, I think that has happened to me. But no, he's telling him to learn to distinguish the self from the body, because that weapons cannot slice. Nainam dahati pavakaha. Pavaka, fire, can't burn it. This is you, the self, cannot be burned by fire. Nachainam kledayantyapo, nor can it be wet by water, wetted by water. And so again, he's speaking of it, the self, but that means you, it means me, it means Arjuna. You know, you, that which you really are, cannot be wetted by water. Nashoshayati maruta. Maruta, the wind, cannot dry it. So you cannot be cut, you can't be burnt, you can't be wetted, you can't be dried. And then he goes on with the same thought in 24. Achedyo yam madahyo yam akledyo shoshya evacha nitya sarvagatasthánur achalo yam sanatanaha. So here he says, Achedyo yam, this self is uncuttable. Adahyo yam, the self is unburnable. Akledyo shoshya evacha, it's also unwetted and undryable, that is, dry out by the wind. It can't be wetted, it can't be dried out. Indeed. Nitya, it is eternal. It's nitya, it's eternal. So there's no fear of death. So again, he's telling this to Arjuna, obviously, because Arjuna is in a life and death situation. And as he will explain in greater detail, you are eternal, you can't die, but those whom you're fighting, they can't die either. So death itself is an illusion. So nitya, you are eternal. The self is eternal. Sarvagata, gone everywhere, literally, which means, of course, all pervading. As you, those of you who have Sanskritic languages, whose mother tongue is Sanskritic, it's a familiar word, sarvagata. It goes everywhere, meaning it's all pervading. That which is everywhere, how can you cut it? How can you wet it? That can be cut, that can be wetted, which has a particular location within space. But this is everywhere. Space itself. Can you cut space? No. We put a wall and say there's space on that side of the wall and another space on that side of the wall. But is space really cut? No. That's only in our mind that we think we've divided space. No, space isn't divided. It pervades the wall itself, which is the barrier. And so the self can't be cut. It can't be because it goes everywhere. And these other things, the burning and drying and everything, because the self is everywhere, nothing can affect it. So nitya sarvagata sthanur, that is sthanur, sthanuhu, that's immovable. It's stable, steady, immovable. Everything in this universe is constantly moving. Everything is in vibration, even the mountains, even the stars, the galaxies, things which look like they last for so long, they're so stable, everything is in vibration. The component parts of matter themselves are in vibration. The atoms, the subatomic particles, light is vibration. Everything is vibration, and vibration means movement. And so everything in this universe is movement, is vibration, but that is stable. It's not vibratory, it's not in motion. There's nothing which can affect it. So again, even the mountains can be affected. But not that. So it's stanu, achala. It doesn't move anywhere, it doesn't go anywhere. The self doesn't go anywhere. That sounds strange because a person like me who travels a lot, sometimes I'm in Houston, sometimes I'm in Austin, sometimes I'm in India, sometimes I'm in Costa Rica. But no, the real I, and I'm speaking for everyone, the real I doesn't go anywhere. I am unmoving. I go nowhere. It's this body which moves in relationship to other objects in the world. But I am the witness, stable, unmoving. And that is only the body moving in relationship to other things. As I've explained on occasion, that when we watch a film, we're sitting in the audience watching the film, and in the film we go to London, we go to South Africa, we go to Antarctica, we go to Mars, we go to the moon, but we're still sitting right there in the theater. We haven't gone anywhere. They're just scenes that pass in front of us. And yet if we get involved, identified with the action of the film, we feel that we have traveled. No, we haven't gone anywhere. And so in truth, because we identify with the body, which is like identifying with the movie screen, the action on the screen, we think that we are going from country to country. We go nowhere. Only scenes are changing in front of us. So it is achala. And it is sanatana. That is, it lasts, is primordial. There was no beginning to it, no end to it. So it's eternal in the sense that it's timeless, and also it's eternal, sanatana, in the sense that there is no beginning and no end. It continues forever. In all of the three periods of time, the past, present, and future, it is. Not that it was, it is, and it will be. It is in the past, it is in the present, it is in the future, unmoving. So the running translation here, this self is indeed incapable of being cut, incombustible, incapable of being moistened and being dried. It is eternal, all-pervading, stable, unmoving, and primordial. So then the thought continues in the next verse also, 25. Avyakto yam achintyo yam avikaryo yam uchyate tasmadevam viditvainam nanushotitum. So avyakto yam, this self, that which you are, and again, because of the problem of language itself, the nature of language, he's saying that this self is, but that means you, me, Arjuna, because I am the self. So it's not, again, the self that's somehow inside of me and is not something inside of me. No, that which I am avyakta, unmanifested. Vyakta, of course, means manifested. Avyakta means unmanifested. Manifested means that which has come into creation, that which has come into visibility of the five senses and thinkable by the mind. But you, the self, you are avyakta. You are unmanifested, undetectable by any of the senses, unthinkable by the mind. But not just avyakta, but achintya. Because you are unmanifested, you are also achintya. You can't be thought of. The self cannot be thought of. Why? Because it's above the mind. The mind can only think about manifested things. The mind can only think about that which is within time and space. This was shown in the West by Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, very famous philosopher, you've all heard his name. And in India, was shown long before Kant's time in the Upanishads and through the Vedantic tradition, that we can only think of that which is bound by time and exists within space. To think of something, it has to have boundaries. It has to be definable in order to think about it. To define something is to make finite, to set the limits. That's what define means, to make it finite, to make it, and to make it finite is to make it comprehensible. So to define something is to make it comprehensible because I'm setting the limits, saying that this is this. These are its limits. This is what it is. You can see it, you can think about it. But the self can't be, it's unmanifested, and so it is unthinkable. It's outside of time, outside of space. So how can it be thought of? And so, achintyo yam avikaryo yamuchyate. It is also said to be unchanging. Vikarya, avikarya. That is, there are no changes taking place within it. Because the self is, as it said in the previous verse, sthanu, stable, and achala, unmoving. And so that which is perfectly stable and unmoving, absolutely unmoving, absolutely stable, that is also avikarya. There are no changes taking place within it. Now, there's one problem with this in our understanding, aside from the fact, of course, he's speaking of the highest truth, which is outside of the mind. So that, of course, makes it hard to begin with. But another difficulty comes that in our experience, in everyday life, something which doesn't move, which is completely unchanging, relatively stable and unchanging, that is something like a rock, something that's dead, dull, insentient. Everything that has life, everything that has sentience, seems to move, seems to react, to respond. And so that which is completely, absolutely stable, absolutely unmoving, that must be the most dead of all dead things. Just worse than a rock, because as I said, even a rock is inwardly moving all of the time. It's vibratory. And so that which is not at all vibratory, not at all moving, not at all changing, that is as dead as you can get. No, that's because we are thinking of the self in terms of our experience of manifested life. So the self is sentience itself, intelligence itself, consciousness itself, existence itself, wisdom itself, knowledge itself. But it's outside of our present experience, and its stability is that which makes it unendingly beautiful, unendingly satisfying. It doesn't change because it doesn't need to change. Change happens because of a need to change, to adapt and so forth. But when there's only one reality, what is it adapting to? There's nothing to adapt to. There are no circumstances outside of it which cause it to adapt. And so, to say that it is tanu, stable, achala, unmoving, avikarya, not undergoing any changes, that doesn't make it dead. It's the most live and the most fulfilling of things. And that's the attainment of that is infinite satisfaction. There's a beautiful name of Shiva. There are 5 names of Shiva given in the Vedas and Upanishads, which are, of course, there are many other names also given in the Shruti as well, but 5 names that are special, and one of them is Sadyojata, Ishana, Sadyojata, Tatpurusha, Vamadeva, etc. So one of them is Sadyojata, which means born anew, born fresh every moment. So Sadyojata, name for Shiva, means born afresh every moment. So not actually that it's coming into birth, but that Shiva, who is the absolute, the self itself, is eternally new. And so that stability, that unmoving nature is not something dead, it's newness itself. That which never grows old. Why? Because it's outside of time. So again, it's all of these things. It's avyakta, unmanifested, it's unthinkable, it's unchanging. Tasmad evam viditvainam, therefore having known it to be thus, as I, Sri Krishna, have just described, having known it to be thus, na anushochitum arhasi. You shouldn't you shouldn't be despondent. You shouldn't grieve for anyone. You shouldn't grieve for the self, because it is of this nature. So yes, the body can be killed, but as he said in a verse we took last time, verse 22, that just as one takes worn out clothes and casts them off, and then takes on new clothes, so when this body is worn out, or when it is killed, this body is discarded and we take on a new body. So therefore, ashochanam vashochastvam prajnavaram bhashase, as he says in verse 11, that you are grieving for those who should not be grieved for, because the self is deathless. And again, the self means you, it means me, it means Arjuna. So it's not talking about something that you have. As Swami Vivekananda used to say, that in the West we have this peculiar expression of I have a soul. No, I don't have a soul, as if I'm one thing and the soul is something somewhere inside of me. Like I have a liver, I have a stomach, I have a heart, I have a spleen, and I also have a soul. No, not like that. I am the soul. The running translation is, this self is said to be unmanifest, unthinkable, and unchangeable. Therefore, knowing it to be such, you, O Arjuna, ought not to grieve. There's nothing to grieve over, because again, that was Arjuna's problem. He was thinking of those that he would be engaged in in battle. And that caused him to grieve, to think of what he was about to do. So Sri Krishna is saying there's nothing to grieve over. So again, this is very strong medicine. Think about it. Think about it if you were actually on a battlefield. Luckily for us, we're not on a battlefield. Those of us who, at least in this class, there are people on a battlefield somewhere in the world right now, but we are not. But think of Arjuna, who is actually on the battlefield and actually about to go into battle against his kinsmen and his own gurus, his own teachers. And so his grieving is natural, but even in that situation, Sri Krishna is saying, you shouldn't grieve for them, because this is the actual truth. So again, that's requiring a very high level of thought for Arjuna, to be able to realize that yes, even in this situation which I'm facing now in Kurukshetra, I shouldn't grieve. I should be equal-minded. And as he'll say time and time again as we go forward in the Gita, we have to attain to same-sidedness. So then in verse 26 he says, and let me say in verse 26, he begins to give other arguments to Arjuna. So he's given the basic argument, which he will come back to, that you shouldn't grieve because the truth is that you are the self and they are the self. There is no death. But now he's coming to other arguments that in case you don't accept that, then these are other arguments why you should fight. So verse 26, he says, Atachainam nitya jatam nityam va manyase mritam tathapi tvam mohabaho nainam shochitam arhasi. So here he says, Ata cha enam nitya jatam nityam va manyase mritam. So even if you think that this self, that which you are, is born and you die, even if you don't accept what I am teaching, but you believe that this self is born, it comes into being and it goes out of being. It's born and it dies. So let's accept that for argument's sake, that the self is born and it dies. Tathapi tvam mohabaho nainam shochitam arhasi. Even then, O mighty armed one. Again, he keeps addressing Arjuna by terms like Mohabaho, you with the mighty arms, or Parandapa, you scorcher of your foes, because he's calling up the heroic nature of Arjuna, because Arjuna has lost that. So he's calling that up. So Tathapi Tvam Mohabaho Nainam Shochitam Arhasi. Even then, even if you think that it's born, that the self is born and it dies, even then you shouldn't grieve. And then he explains why in verse 27. He says, Jatasya hi dhruvo mrityur dhruvam janmamritasya cha tasmada pariharyerte natvam shochitam arhasi. So Jatasya hi dhruvo mrityur. For one who is born, death is certain. Dhruvam janma mritasya cha, and for one who is, oh wait, let's see. For the born, death, yes, for the born, death is certain, and birth is certain for the one who dies, that is rebirth. So it's certain that the born is going to die. As many great sages have said, including Einstein in modern times, that the one thing that we can all be certain of is death. The one thing that you can predict for every being born into this world. You may not be an astrologer, you may not have insight into the future in any other way, but you can predict with finality, with absolute certainty, that this being is going to die. So whatever is born, it's going to die, that is certain. There has never in billions of years been an exception to that. And that which dies is going to be reborn. Now that we can't prove scientifically yet, but that is the faith of the scriptures, that is the faith that the sages have given us, and that many people here in the West also, I forget the percentage, but a very large percentage of Americans believe in rebirth. I even once, this was back in 1982, I was visiting the Berkeley Center, and Swami Swananda, not Swahananda, but Swananda, Sunil Maharaj, he was head of the Berkeley Center. And so I was staying with him for a few days, and one day he came to me and said, today, a student from a local seminary, Christian seminary, is coming, and as part of his coursework, he has to visit places of worship of other religions, so he's coming here. And so can you take him around, talk to him, etc. So I said, sure, Maharaj. So I took him around, showed him around, and then we came back to sit in the library to if he had any questions. And so he said, do you believe in reincarnation? And so I thought he was asking because being a Christian, he's training to be a Christian minister, a Protestant minister. And so I thought that, of course he doesn't believe it, but he's curious, if we believe in such a strange thing as reincarnation, which he doesn't believe in. So I said, yes. I said, it's not like a dogma that you have to believe in that when you sign on to be a Vedantin, but the vast majority of us just accept it as, because it fits in with the thoughts naturally. And so, yes, I do believe it. I'm convinced of it. And so then he surprised me. He said, I also believe it. I'm not, it's not part of our religion, but I also am convinced that there's no other explanation for experience. And then in my own life, my aunt and many other people I've met who had no influence of Eastern thought whatsoever believed in reincarnation. And so we can't scientifically prove reincarnation at this point, but there is evidence for it. Of course, as a Hindu, it comes naturally if one is at all in touch with the tradition and not just born into a Hindu family. And I'm Hindu because I was born from Hindu parents, but I don't care for any of that old stuff. Then you may not believe in reincarnation. But if you're in touch with the tradition, yes, it's just a natural part of the thinking process. And so, for one who is born, death is certain. To one who dies, rebirth is certain. Tasmada pariharyarthe natvam shochitumarhasi. Therefore, of that which cannot be, that which is inevitable, one shouldn't grieve. Why should you grieve over that which is inevitable? Once you are born, you're going to die at some point. So yes, it may be when you're 95 or 100 years old, or it may be when you're 6 months old, or it may be at any time after your birth, but you're going to die. And if you die, you're going to be reborn. You keep coming back until you have worked out the problem of life. And so if that is inevitable, why should you grieve? So again, here he's taking another argument, as I said. He's saying, okay, if you don't accept what I said about the eternity of the self, then even if you just look at birth and rebirth, then that's inevitable. So why grieve over that? Those that you are going to kill, or if you be killed, what will happen is you take rebirth. And once you are killed, all of the pains of this life are forgotten. So it's not like you killed somebody and it was a terrible experience in battle, and so then their suffering goes on because they were killed in battle. No. Once death comes, it's a release. Once you die, then whatever pain you were experiencing, whatever tragedies you went through in life, all of the sorrows you went through in life, it's erased. It's erased. So I've known people, many people have had near-death experiences where they have clinical death, but then they're brought back to life. And people who have had that experience have told me, and I've read books about clinical studies of clinical death when people were resuscitated. And people told me, and books written on the subject also say, that when a person passes away, they lose, clinically, and then comes back, they lose all fear of death, because then they know that death has no meaning. Death isn't death, it's not destruction. In fact, one of the people that told me about his experience, one of our devotees, Harry Greer, a disciple of Swami Vishwanandaji of Chicago, and Harry Greer actually did finally pass away many years ago in Sacramento. But he told me that long before his actual death, that he had a clinical death. He was in the hospital, and when he was clinically dead, he left the body, and he could see the body down below, and his wife was there in the hospital while he was undergoing this procedure. And his heart stopped, he died, and his wife, the doctor said, "Oh, we've lost him." And his wife started chanting, "Hari Om Ramakrishna, Hari Om Ramakrishna, Hari Om Ramakrishna," which is a mantra we chant when people die. And so with that, Harry Greer felt that he was being pulled back into the body, and he resented it. He didn't want to go back to the body. He had left the body and felt so free. Why should I go back to that? And so that is the experience of some also. So for one who is born, death is certain, and to one who dies, rebirth is certain. Therefore, over this inevitable fact, you, O Arjuna, ought not to grieve. And then he continues this thought in verse 28, Avyaktadini bhutani vyaktamadhyani bharata avyakta nidhananyeva tatra ka paridevana. So avyakta adini bhutani. So in the beginning, beings are unmanifested. That is, before birth, we were unmanifested. Vyakta madhyani bharata. In the middle, we become manifested. Avyakta nidhanani. At death, nidhana, death, then once again we are unmanifested. So tatraka paridevana, what is there to lament over in that? Why should you be sad over that? Before birth you are unmanifested. With birth you become manifested, here present in this world. When you die, you again become unmanifested. So here, what does unmanifested mean? Here it doesn't mean like the self itself, which is infinite and completely outside of creation. No, it means that you're not visible in this bhuloka, this physical world that we inhabit now. Before you're born, no one sees you here. You're in a different state. Yes, you're manifest in that state, just not manifested here. And then you're born, you come into manifestation in bhuloka, in the earthly sphere. And when you die, you disappear from this sphere. So you're unmanifested from this sphere, but you exist in another state until you take birth again. And so if you are unmanifested before birth, you're manifested, and then after death, you're unmanifested again. So what should you lament over? The self is continuous in all of those. When you are unmanifested, when you're manifested, when you are again unmanifested, the self is continuous. Swami Vivekananda says that when the self can never die, try to think, he says, try to think of your own death. And then he says, if you try to do that, you'll see that you were there watching your own death. So if you try to imagine your own death, if you're seeing that, okay, now I'm dying, and there the body is, and I'm dead, and people are weeping. Maybe some people are laughing, but those who are happy that I'm dead. But hopefully people are weeping. But you were there watching it. So now when I first read that in Swamiji, I thought, well, that's just a play on words, because it's because I'm imagining it, so of course I'm watching it, because it's just imagination. But when I'm really dying, then that's different. No, it's not different. Look at the case of Ramana Maharshi. That's how he attained to illumination. As a boy of 16, he felt one day after school in the afternoon at home, he felt, I'm dying. But it was a real feeling. It wasn't imagination. He felt that I'm dying. Suddenly this came over, it overwhelmed him. And so he thought, but what does it mean to die? What's happening to me? So he lay down on the floor and he watched himself undergo the death process. And so he felt that all of his prana was being withdrawn from all of the organs, pulled into his heart. The body was going cold, and then the prana was leaving the body. But through all of that, he realized that I still am. I'm watching the whole process. Death is taking place, but I'm still here. I haven't gone anywhere. And with that, he realized the self. And for the rest of his long life, until he was 70 years old, more or less, 70 or a little above, I think it was actually 70, he lived in a state of realization, a state of illumination, where he knew himself to be the infinite self, deathless and birthless. So what Swamiji said actually happened in Ramana Maharshi's life. And that is true. When we actually die, we will be there watching the process. So we are there before birth, we're there during birth, we're there after birth, and we're there in death and after death. So why limit for that? So that was verse 28. And then verse 29, he says, and this is a verse which is shared with a minor change of wording, but the intent is the same and almost the same wording in the Katha Upanishad. In fact, many verses in the Gita are present also in the Katha Upanishad. They're closely related scriptures. So 29 says, Ascharyavat pashyati kastirenam, Ascharyavat badati tathaiva chanyaha, Ascharyavat chainam anyashrinoti, Shrutvaapyenam vedana chaiva kastit. So this says, Ascharyavat pashyati kastirenam. There are some who see the self. That is, they see and experience the self. They realize the self with ascharyavat, with astonishment, as if astonished. Sri Ramakrishna says that the first high spiritual experience is when the heart awakens and the aspirant sees a light within the heart and says, ah, what is this? What is this? Ascharyavat, a sense of wonder. It's seeing this light within the heart, which is the light of the self, not fully realized, but the first glimpse of it. And so one says, ah, what is this? What is this? And so Sri Krishna says that there are some who see the self with wonder. Ascharyavat bharati tathaiva chanya. Others speak of it with wonder. That is, a person who has realized it, speaks of it with wonder. The self is like this. Verahametam purusham mahantam. I have known that ancient one, that Purusha, as Swamiji said at the Parliament of Religions in Chicago. Ascharyavat chaina manya srinoti. Others hear of it from a qualified teacher. They hear of it with wonder. So some see it with wonder. Others speak of it with wonder. Having realized it, they speak of it with wonder. Others hear of it from such people with wonder. Shrutvaapyenam vedana chaiva kastit. Others, having heard, they don't understand it. So, if you go out into this, go out into the marketplace of the world, and you're sitting with people, and you try to tell them something about the Vedantic knowledge of the self, the great majority of people will say either that, well, that's kind of interesting, but who cares? And other people will say, well, that sounds crazy to me, and so who cares? And so most people, it makes no difference to them. If they hear it, as we say, it goes in one ear and out the other ear. If they even let it pass through, they may just reject it before it even gets into the ear. So the running translation goes, one sees this self as a wonder. So also another talks of this as a wonder. Still another hears of this as a wonder. And some other again does not know this even after hearing about it. And so yes, that is very true. So if one hears about the self or hears about God, because God and the self are not two different things. They're two manifestations of the same reality of Brahman. But if one hears about the self or about God and feels attracted, at least a little bit, then that is the seed of spiritual life. If we hear about God or the self and we don't feel anything, no interest, we just want to get on with life and forget about all of that. Who cares about all of that stuff, religious stuff? Then spiritual life doesn't begin for us. It's not possible. And so such a person, you can beat them over the head with the scriptures, trying to explain to them and trying to interest them, and it won't work. So that's why Sri Ramakrishna would tell his devotees and disciples who would come to him, people who were so excited about having met someone like Sri Ramakrishna, they would go and tell their friends, oh, you must come and see this remarkable man. So they would bring their friends to meet Sri Ramakrishna. And Sri Ramakrishna would see that the person had no spiritual stuff whatsoever. They had no interest. They were only there because their friend had dragged them. Then he would tell his devotees and disciples, why do you bring such people here? It's like blowing on wet wood trying to start a fire. You put a match to wet wood and you blow on it trying to get it to catch, and it doesn't work. You just exhaust yourself. So if a person has even the slightest interest in spirituality, then that is enough. That's the ember, that's the little spark which will allow you eventually to, and so nurture that, nurture it. So then verse 30, he says, Dehi nityam avadyoyam dehe sarvasya bharata tasmat sarvani bhutani natvam shochitamarhasi. So Dehi nityam avadyoyam. Now he's coming back to his original thought. And then he's going to go to another argument after this, but first he comes back to his original thought. So again, first he was teaching about the eternity of the self. It can't be destroyed. Then he said, well, even if you don't accept that, you see that beings come into being, they're born, and then they die. And then they're reborn, and then they die, and then they're reborn. So why weep for that which is inevitable? So he came to this other argument, just sort of a pragmatic argument. But now he's coming back to his original and says, the Dehi, the one who dwells within the body is the Deha. So Dehi is one who dwells within the body, Dehin. Nityam, the Dehi, the dweller within the body, is eternal, Nityam. Avadyoyam, and unkillable. It can't be destroyed. Ayam Dehe Sarvasya Bharata, that the indweller of the body within the body of everyone here, not just one or two people who are lucky, but within every embodied being, it is Nityam and Avadya. It's eternal and it's indestructible. Tasmat sarvani bhutani natvam shochitamarhasi. Therefore, you shouldn't weep for anyone, Arjuna, because the one dwelling within the body is indestructible. The body is not me. My problem comes because I've identified with the body, and when something affects the body, I feel affected. But the actual indweller in the body, that which I am when you say I, that I is the indweller. You are the indweller. You are the Dehi, not the Deha, but the Dehi. That is indestructible. And so therefore you shouldn't weep for any created being, because every sentient being is the Dehi, not the Deha. The bodies of all beings die, of humans, of animals, of insects, of plants, but the Dehi is never destroyed in any type of life. And so the next verse takes up another line of thought. So I won't go over that. I'll just give a preview and just say that the next line of thought is that you should look, even if you don't accept all of this that I've said, then look at it just from the standpoint of your own dharma, your swadharma. Therefore, also you should fight. So that's the next line of attack that he gives. So one of the beauties of the Gita is that our Sri Krishna, he gives a place for everything, and he explains things from different points of view. So that if one thing doesn't make sense to you, there's another point of view that will make sense to you. And so there are many other unique features of the Gita. It's the most marvelous of scriptures. And that's why it's the most popular of all of the Hindu scriptures. The one which has been translated the most, the one which is studied the most, the one which is memorized the most, even more than the Shruti, even more than the Upanishads and the Vedas. And so we'll stop here. And again, I can't ask you for questions because I'm here and you're not yet tuned in. But my thanks to Shonak for his facilitating this, making it possible. And so I will be back live next week on Saturday at the usual time. So I will say good night to, no, good morning to everyone, because it's night right now, but when you see this, it will be morning. So good morning to everyone. I hope all are well, all are safe. And now I'll give a closing chant, which again is from the Gita Dhyana, the last verse, verse 9. Om Yam Brahma Varunendra Rudra Marutastun Vandi Divyaistavaihi Vedai Sangapada Kramopanishadair Gayandiyam Samaga Dhyanavastita Tadgatena Manasa Pashyandiyam Yogino Yasyantam Navidu Sura Suragana Devaya Tasmai Namaha. We bow to that Supreme Being, whom Brahma and other gods praise with divine hymns, whose glories the singers of the Sama hymns sing through the Vedas and Upanishads, whom the yogis see with their minds absorbed in that through meditation, and whose end and beginning neither the gods nor the asuras know. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Om peace, peace, peace be unto us and to all the beings of the universe.